Hi, my name is Anna Victoria Wong. I'm a doctor in speech-language pathology and registered speech-language pathologist in Ontario, Canada. Thank you for taking time to watch this video today. I'm here to introduce the concept of how to serve a diverse clientele as an SLP. It is important for us to know not only for the fact that target clientele deserves the level of respect and cultural linguistic responsiveness from their allied health professionals, it is also for us as professionals to safeguard our license and best practices by complying with the cultural specific needs of our clients. In order to do that, we need to understand the services that we provide as a profession, and in turn, how each of these aspects of services that we provide will affect clients. Maybe, for most of us, the first thing that comes to mind with diversity is speech. We're probably thinking about accent. Okay, so there is articulation for speech sound productions in diverse clienteles. There's also the service of accent reduction, and there is also fluency, which is also part of speech. The other bucket of service that we provide is language, in terms of language planning, reading, and writing. And then pragmatics is the third bucket that we can discuss in terms of social skills, sharing, demonstration of empathy, eye contact, interaction, initiation, joint attention, balanced participation, responsiveness, and also the level of social independence and the ability to seek help and advocate for oneself. The next bucket of services that we provide is voice treatment. Vocal pathology can result from vocal abuse, could be resulting from the occupation that the patient actually takes. And there is also the population of laryngectomies of post-cancer surgery patients. Another one yet is cognition. Memory, the ability to organize and plan, the ability to have insights and predictions, the ability to understand relationships and cause and effects. Last one is swallowing. It goes from cradle to grave. Neonatal feeding issues, dysphagia in adults, swallowing disorders, and swallowing safety for caregivers, diet consistencies, and prevention of aspiration pneumonia. All of these are the work of SLPs. Now, first off, we need to protect ourselves as a profession. There are actually laws that governs the level of respect one or actually any human being is entitled to. So from the Canadian Human Rights Act, here is a list of the grounds for discrimination: race, national origin or an ethnic origin, color, religion, age, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity or gender expression, marital status, family status, disability, genetic characteristics, pardoned or suspended conviction. Now, under the UN Convention and the US Charter of Rights, there are actually other ones that you can add on top of it. So please go back to reference your own local legislation regarding grounds for discrimination. By understanding the series of grounds of discrimination, we have a better benchmark to guard ourselves to or to conduct ourselves professionally in order to avoid or unknowingly discriminate others or exhibit behaviors or speech that others may perceive as discrimination. Now, how do all of these apply to service? Number one was speech in the first of the 6 buckets of SLPs. Diversity in speech manifests itself in accent, but also the underlying cause may be a difference in phonotactic patterns. So for some languages, they don't actually share the same phonotactic patterns as others, such as the V and the Z and the TH sounds in English is not universal in all languages. In East Asian languages, for example, they're not all there. In Chinese, there is no TH voiced or voiceless. There's no V because of the voice. However, there is an F. In the Filipino language of Tagalog, there is no F and there is no V. So you may hear them manifest themselves to become P and B because it becomes a stop. Now, there are languages that are tonal versus atonal. English is moderately atonal, as in tones usually don't affect the meaning of the word itself. However, there are other languages where tones actually significantly alter the meaning of words. So we need to watch out when we are treating clients for speech. When they come from tonal languages, there are markers that would be marking themselves wrong in terms of articulation, not only because of the motor, but also because of the voice. Other than accents, there's also intralingual variations, such as in English. Even in standard American English, people articulate S's differently. There is the S that is dental alveolar. There is the tongue down S versus tongue up. There's also vernacular within any particular language, such as the African American English. Their vowels are very different from standard American English, and the vowels naturally are very different from received pronunciation in the United Kingdom. Diversity also happens in language. So in language, apart from reading and writing and language planning, we can actually break that down into very many smaller aspects of language. We can start with print orientation. To flip open an English book, you may open it from right to left. The cover opens from right to left. However, there are other languages where the book cover actually opens from left to right. So you would start the book the other way around. Also, there are alphabets or text direction that is different. English writes from left to right. There are languages that write from right to left, such as Hebrew. And there are languages that can exist in any left-right or right-left order, or vertical orders, such as Chinese. The letter case is also specific to certain languages. The fact that English has title case, uppercase, and lowercase in this alphabet does not mean that that case distinction exists in all other languages. Most East Asian languages, for example, do exist without cases, actually. And punctuation. Punctuation in English is usually mandatory. It is actually not the case in some other languages, such as in Chinese. You can have punctuation, but the more formal versions of Chinese, or the more archaic versions of Chinese, or when it's written in a poetic style, takes no punctuation. Tenses. Tenses manifest in English as morphemes themselves. Tenses actually may manifest in other non-Romance or non-Germanic languages as separate words. So their tense markers may not be a suffix or prefix, or it may not be a change of vowel within the word itself, but the marker exists as a separate word. So with an additional word appended to the end of the verb, that becomes a tense marker. Also, conditions in Romance and Germanic language exist very differently in other languages. In most East Asian languages, they simply exist in different words. So the sentence structure would be altered, but not exactly the word itself would be altered. There are also languages that have multiple alphabet systems. So English has the alphabet systems from A to Z. However, Japanese is a very good example. Japanese itself has 4 alphabet systems. So its most traditional and original alphabet system is hiragana. It is written usually in a serif font because it's shown as the brush stroke to show its traditional font face, to show that it is actually the traditional alphabet of hiragana. However, it also has loaned languages. So loaned language components exist in almost like a transcription way. But to show the transcription itself, it also developed the second alphabet system called katakana. And when it's actually listed together with the traditional alphabet system, katakana shows usually in a non-serif font. So when you see a one sentence with different font faces, it actually may not be a formatting error. It may actually be a way to show to the reader the different code switch that it is using. And the third one up is Romanji. This is for people who actually understands the English alphabet. So in order to say wasabi that we eat, Romanji shows it as the English alphabet of W-A-S-A-B-I. Right? And it also actually, in English, obviously, it means the word wasabi that we know. But the fact that we spell out wasabi is because it's actually Romanji in Japanese. And the other loaned language that Japanese adopts a lot is Chinese. Therefore, there is this kanji. Kanji actually literally translates into Chinese characters. Han Dynasty is where it originated from. So you would see very boxy characters with multiple brushstrokes, not exactly alike like the original alphabet systems of Japanese. It looks more like Chinese characters. That alphabet system is a loaned language, and it's called kanji. So in terms of print itself, it's already very varied across different languages and can be very varied within the language itself. There are some languages that also prints itself out using transcriptions. So sometimes you would, and it would actually be, it's actually more utilized nowadays than before, such as in social media or chat room languages. Sometimes people write out transcriptions instead of the actual word. So in English, people, you would portray it as sometimes people spell things differently because it's online language. For online languages, in some other languages, they actually write out the transcription instead of the word. And for SLPs, our transcriptions means the IPA. But the IPA, as much as we think it is universal, it's actually not so universal. There are other language learners from their mother tongue, their transcriptions are very different. So for Mandarin learners, the way they learn their own language, that transcription sounds are actually a consonant vowel combo. So for the sound B, they actually transcribe it as B-O. So for a series of stops, instead of saying they transcribe it as B-O, bo, P-O, po, M-O, mo, and F-O, fo. So the transcription itself, the system is very different. And the other side of the world, Taiwanese Mandarin uses a very different transcription system. It is a separate alphabet system than itself. So within even the language of Chinese alone, there are different transcription systems. Also, there are dialects. So if you think Mandarin is the national language of the country of China, you would know that they have Fujianese, Shanghainese, Cantonese, and many other dialects. And some dialects, when their written and verbal systems are strong enough, are actually deemed languages instead of dialects in the Book of the United States. And those may vary, so I encourage you to go back to reference it the day of your research. There are countries where languages have strong foreign language influence. So in English, some examples would be, when you say foie gras or when you say clairvoyant, those are French foreign influences. The same actually happens in other languages too. So stamp is just as an English language influence in Chinese. It becomes sidam in Cantonese. And the English language influence in Japan, such as soup and coffee, becomes suppo and kohi. So it happens actually in a lot of other languages as well. They're just that their articulation patterns would be quite different, and their print patterns may differ as well. So we talked about Japanese, where they have different alphabet systems. Font faces actually play a role. Like I said before, for the Japanese to decipher between their original or traditional alphabet system, hiragana, with the foreign language influenced alphabet system, katakana, they use a serif font for the traditional one and a non-serif font for the foreign language one. Now, there are some languages where the print system is quite different, such as Chinese. In the past less than 100 years, the calligraphy or the orthographic system of simplified Chinese was developed. It was mainly developed after the Cultural Revolution. A Cultural Revolution was an era in history where a lot of schooling systems were transformed majorly, and there was a period where schooling was actually non-existent or very lagging behind. So having a simplified orthographic system makes it easier for people to learn. So traditional Chinese exists in places like Hong Kong and Taiwan, and simplified Chinese is used in the mainland China as well as the Singapore. There is also diversity that manifests itself in pragmatics, and it is more than you think the Italian hand gestures. So pragmatics happen in eye contact, initiation, question and answer routine, and assumption of personal space, the level of a person's assertiveness, confirmation, and their way to express negation, to name a few. Diversity here actually manifests itself not only in terms of the races or the languages people use, but it's also in socio-economic power. It is also across gender, and there is a power differential. So you can think of it in a family system or in a society system where certain roles or certain genders or certain age, particular sectors of people have different eye contacts and level of initiation or role playing in question and answers. There are some very traditional cultures where in a social or corporate hierarchy, these so-called people that are the workers that are so-called lower down in the social hierarchy actually manifest less eye contact directly to their superiors, or in public spaces where they coexist with their superiors. So that is a cultural difference. And also, you may as SLPs or teachers, notice that the level of initiation, help-seeking behavior, and question and answer behaviors are quite different from certain ethnic groups in your student population. And that could be because of the home country where they came from. You know, students in certain countries are actually taught to be very studious, obedient student, and they're more accustomed to the style of the sage on stage, I listen and I go home and do homework type style. So that's not a right or wrong, that's just a cultural behavior differences. So you would see that eye contact, initiation, help-seeking behavior, and Q&As may be showing up less in certain ethnic populations, and that may not be a red flag in terms of, you know, reduced pragmatic behaviors and therefore, you know, learning disabilities or ASDs. Those may actually not be red flags. That actually may be a result of their cultural differences. Also, in different SES contexts or power differential contexts, the level of assertiveness, the ability for someone to confirm themselves or negate someone else may be different. Even within the same culture, the same race, and the same age group, you know, people in the office space may have different levels of assertiveness and different ability to say no. It could be a matter of personality. It could also be a matter of corporate culture. It could also be a result of power differential. Facial expressions, hand gestures, and head gestures may be different because of that person's personality, or it may also be a result of cultural differences. Some cultures exhibit a lot more expressions that are physical, some cultures less so. And tonal responses or verbal acknowledgement. Some cultures exhibit more systemic and routine, automatic and reflexive verbal acknowledgement, such as when someone is going on a tangent like I am now, they would and nod a lot more. But there are some cultures that would typically remain silent until you finish, and they raise their hands to get their turns to speak. And this actually happens in churches too. You know, in different congregations, you would see the congregation saying amen to the sermon a lot. Whereas in the same church, but with different populations, the crowd would actually stay silent until it is their role to speak up. So all of these also, apart from power differentials, social settings, they also, pragmatic differences also exhibit in the differences of gender. So there are some cultures where, in more extreme cases, women are not allowed to share the dining table with the rest of the family, where they need to be in the kitchen, right? That's not for all cultures, and it's not for the entire culture. Let's say, name one. And because I'm of Chinese descent, I guess I can say that. There are in certain dialectal populations of China where the level of chauvinism is very different. I've heard of cases, and I actually have family members myself who came from that culture where the mom was actually not able to share the dining table with the rest of the family. So naturally, their speech patterns would be very different. Their pragmatic patterns would be very different. And there are also cases where there are domestic helpers in the house, and they are not allowed, so to speak, to share the dining space together with the family, and they would be eating in a different room. So naturally, the social, linguistic, and behavioral differences would be pretty noticeable. So that goes with peer dynamics. It could be within the same race, it could be within the same age group and same setting, but there are naturally some personalities that are more dominating, some personalities that are more vocal, and there are some that are more reserved. Therefore, the peer dynamics also play a role in the diversity and in pragmatics. And that goes to the follower-leader differential. It may be the workplace where the boss talks a lot and the crowd remains silent and never asks a question until one day something blows up. Or it could be just a matter of siblings, because of a more dominant sibling and a slower developed one, and therefore there is a follower-leader differential or an interdependency in terms of a pragmatic behavior between the two, or it just could be a matter of personality differences. So in a lot of these cases, these are unwritten rules made more complex by the social and environmental settings that they're in. And for those differences in behaviors, we as SLPs need to notice the differences and respect that. In certain contexts, there is a reason for the differences in behavior, and not to be labeling as quickly or assuming that those are deficiencies in behaviors or pragmatic abilities. Apart from pragmatics, the other bucket of SLP profession is voice. So this is easier to explain or to understand. There are gender roles in voice. In some cultures, you would actually hear that a lot of the girls in the same age groups would actually use the same voice, regardless of their birth voice. It could be a entertainment business, a media influence type thing, or it could just be a social gender expectation type thing. So they tend to assimilate to each other in terms of the voice that they use in their own gender. And the age also plays a role. So for someone who is assumed to be more socially or corporate powerful, their voice are expected to be at a certain level of depth. Right, so you don't expect me to talk about talk to you like this in a video, versus if I were to use a deeper voice, to certain people, they would stereotype it as more credible. So that goes with occupations as well. So there are occupations where the voice need to be a certain projection, or their articulation also are expected to be different. One very stereotypical example could be the radio announcer or the sports narrator, right, where they actually need to fall under a certain expectation or box on how they use their own voices. The other population that is actually a specific population to treat is the transgender population, where how a male voice, originally male voice, needs to be treated to show more feministic qualities. And for SLPs to be treating that population, we don't only need to respect the patients or the clients need to transition their voice or transform their voice, we also need to respect their need for additional privacy. So they may actually need to be entering your clinic from a different door and waiting in a different waiting room. And they may actually not answer your calls in public, but would actually message you back just because they are less comfortable with their voice, with their altered, in contrast with their altered body when they're, showing themselves in public. So we need to respect that as well. The second last bucket of service that we do is cognition. So we need to understand the diversity in levels of cognition across different cultural populations. People come from different places of the world. They also come from different times of the world. We have to understand that different times of the world in different places are very different from the luxury of peace that we are enjoying now while watching this video. Some people come from war-torn countries. Some people came from countries where there was a cultural revolution and a lack of access to school and education when they were young and in need for education. So that level of education or literacy actually affects them a lot in adulthood when we're assessing them for cognition. For someone who was illiterate as a baseline, and if we use something like a Western aphasia battery, you need to be reading out certain things and understanding complex sentences like the quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog. That may actually not be possible for someone who came from history such as the ones that I described just now. So it may be we may actually choose to not score that wrong because, or we need to score the WOB with sensitivity because that actually may not be the baseline of that person. So they might have taken a few years of school, but after 60 years of life, they have forgotten a lot about reading and writing because they've never had the opportunity to use that much. Or, they mastered English as their second language, but after a stroke, they lose their subsequently languages first and regress a lot in their primary language. So the fact that they were bilingual before the stroke and does not mean that you should score them the same way after the stroke because their baselines were actually very different. The level of ability in different languages may be actually very different. And cultural norms and social norms and values are actually very different as well, I find. There are cultures where the family plays a very critical role. So, when talking about cognition and when your client is deficient in cognition, the family would answer a lot of questions for you. So that the family interview becomes a very big part of your results. But family interviews would be, partially based on the pre-morbid behavior and partially based on the post-morbid behavior. We have to be cognizant of the fact that family may actually sometimes not understand very clearly the differences before and after. And because they have been with the patient for so long, there may be assumptions and projections made on what they think the patient is asking for or responding to, which actually may not be accurate. One major challenge that I see as SLPs serving a ethnic immigrant population in North America is the varying ability of self-reflection and self-evaluation. I find that level of schooling and cultural norms actually play a very big role in someone's ability to actually self-reflect. It may not be true that their schools don't encourage the fact that everyone needs to self-reflect, but the way that that skill was taught was probably very different than how in North America that skill was taught. So I don't have the answer to that question, but I can assure you that based on my experience treating the bulk of this population here in North America, the ability for your patients to self-reflect was hard before, so pre-morbid as hard as it is post-morbid. parental models also play a role. So if their parents came from a country where the education system is very different, now the kid is in a family in North America in an educational system where you and I both understand very well. The kid is actually exposed to two very different and very contrasting education system and value system, and their behavior may be a mixture of these two models. So they, in certain sense, they will show varying behavior, and that may not be a red flag. It may also just be a result of parental models. The last bucket of services that we provide is swallowing. So, swallowing safety, we're very attuned to, and we understand very well the differences in diet consistency. But how do we describe that to our clients? How do we make sure that what we say is very well applied in the client's life? So when you say, on your mashed potato, put some cream to add moisture to grains and starch and soft solids, what does that mean to someone who actually never eats mashed potato, and for someone who actually, cream is not part of their diet? So you need to understand the diets of your patients, not only from a clinical dietary restriction point of view, such as low sugar for diabetics and keto diets for certain people with seizures, but also their cultural diets. So what is the starch that they eat? If it's not potatoes in the Western society, it could be rice, it could be non-bread, it could be bread, it could be noodles. Even in the Chinese diets itself, Northern Chinese diets and Southern Chinese diets can actually be very different. There are also cultural and religious dietary restrictions or preferences, so kosher, or the lack of spice use in certain Buddhist populations is not only just, they need to be vegetarian. In stricter Buddhist protocols, actually spices are actually also not allowed. The use of sauce and moisture in different cultures are actually also very different. So, in the Western society or in North America, you may think of, a baked potato with sour cream or a mashed potato with gravy. You can think of, the fact that, can you actually eat your mashed potato without gravy? Or can you eat your pancakes without syrup? That's the kind of distinction that we have to be aware of. So some cultures take the sauce or what we think as sauce as the main. So let's say the Indian diet, curry. So it is not curry chicken as in the chicken is the main, but the curry dish itself is the main. So it's chicken curry, vegetable curry. The sauce itself is the main. So this would be a problem for people who need to avoid mixed consistency diet. So in the curry, there would be grains, it would be vegetables, or it could be proteins. So how do we tell them to avoid mixed consistencies? You may think of it as, vegetable soup, so you have the liquid and you drink the liquid, but, sift out the veggies. What if the vegetable soup is not what they eat in their whole entire life, right? So you need to understand that their liquid could be the curry. Their soup may be very different. Now, on the topic of soup, the Western society thinks of soup as in the liquid itself and anything within it. And when you say soup, you may say you drink the soup. You may say you eat the soup, because the soup to you could be an entree. In most East Asian cultures, the soup itself actually is not an entree. When the East Asian cultures refer to soup, they could be making a very big broth. There could be a lot of proteins, grains, and vegetables within the soup, just like the Western soups. But when they refer to the soup, they're actually referring to the liquid itself. And they certainly don't just drink the soup as an entree or as the meal alone. The soup may be to start or to finish off a meal, but never the whole meal. And many a times they actually drink the liquid and treat the solids very differently. So when you say soup to them, it's actually not the whole meal. So when you're prescribing your diet alterations or modifications, please be cognizant that if you're referring to soup, you make sure you refer to the other solid entrees as well. And there are some cultures where the starch is a staple, and there are some cultures where starch is used very differently. Such as there was one time, one of my Indian friends came to Toronto to visit me, and they asked to enjoy the most authentic Chinese food. So I showed them to a place, sort of fine dining Chinese food, and then they complained about, that waiter didn't tell me that dish that I ordered didn't have a lot of sauce. So needlessly, we ordered the rice. That shows you there's very different concepts between the use of grains or starch across just the two Asian cultures, Indian and Chinese. So and for Southern Chinese, at a typical meal, there is rice. There is the bowl of rice as a staple, regardless of what you eat, regardless of whether there is sauce. But for my friend who came from Indian culture, she was thinking, well, I would only have that grain or the starch if there was enough moisture to go with it. I expected your dishes to have a lot of moisture, but there wasn't enough sauce to go with the rice, so it was a waste. It's actually, even within the same continents and very close by cultures, the concepts could be very different. So when you say put a lot of moisture on your starch or on your semi-dry solids or dental soft solids to your patients, you actually need to understand what solids they're eating. So if you're referring to their starch, for the Asian cultures, whether it is a naan bread or the dumpling or the noodles or the rice, they actually may not put things on top of it. They may actually use it to eat with another dish that may or may not have sauce. So how you design their own meals for them is your ability to get creative. If you don't apply your own science to their daily life, the compliance level is likely going to be very low because your patient is not going to understand what you're talking about, nor will their food preparers understand what you're talking about. You also need to understand the differences in the use of spice and consistencies, right? So there are some diets where the use of spice is very heavy. And for some of your populations where, if there was a use of blood thinners in their medication list, or they're preparing for surgery, they need to be off spice. So when you're trying to say to them, cut off your spice for 2 weeks now, for someone like me who takes no spice at all, for me, ground pepper is too spicy, right? So I understand that as in anything that tastes or feel mildly heated. For someone who comes from cultures where spice is a staple, they may not think of cumin, ginger, black pepper, or chili flakes as spice. So you actually need to be very specific with them what parts of their diets they need to cut out, because their baseline is very different from your baseline. And for maximal level of compliance, you need to understand who is actually preparing the food for them. Is the patient itself? For aphasic patients, most likely not, because of their post-stroke and the very high probability of mobility restrictions. So would it be their wife? Would it be their sons and daughters? Would it be their parents? Would it be their caregivers or the PSWs, which change, or CNAs, which change every day? They come to your house, or they come to your hospital bed, there'll be a different one preparing a meal for them every day. So we need to make sure whoever is taking care of them understands how they can or cannot prepare certain foods and how they can or cannot feed certain foods. After understanding all 6 levels or 6 buckets of services that SLPs provide, the one last question that SLPs in the multicultural population often encounter is, should I introduce bilingual education to my kid? Is it what's causing him to be delayed in languages, especially in kids with special needs? right? So we need to understand the pros and cons of bilingual or multilingual education first. So for the ethnic population in North America, these families may want to preserve their home language and cultural values with their children. So the pros for bilingual education would be to, then there is better ways for the kid to scaffold for future learning because there is more than one system of building blocks. And they may get better career prospects because that opens their ability up to different populations within the country. Now the cons would be, and these may be short-term cons or these may be long-term cons depending on the ability of the specific kid we're talking about. So language development process may actually take longer. So instead of a steady curve that straight goes up, it may be a longer plateau time before a huge boom. And during that time, parents may think there is a delay, or health practitioners may flag the kid for an SLP, developmental language assessment. And another con would be the fact that it is less suitable for kids who have learning disabilities or ASD. And another thing that we need to be cognizant of is the fact that parents with foreign language accents may actually transfer that to the child. So we may have children in the school system that speaks 90% fluent English without a hitch, but you would see them going F for the sound well beyond age 9. So that's after the phonological development. They're still doing the F for the TH. It may actually not be a developmental issue that warrants a regimen to articulation therapy. It may be a cultural difference. So articulation therapy, if you choose to implement that, would be very different in terms of the reason, and maybe different in terms of the treatment plan. Lastly, in terms of understanding the process of bilingual development, initially the child would use the home language for a brief period of time. That's because that's the first language that they know. And then going to school, the child learns a different language, most likely English or Spanish in America or French in Canada, right? And then there is a clash between the home language and the new official language that is being taught to the child. So the child goes into a silent or nonverbal period for a period of time from weeks to months. It depends on how fast the child can actually process the distinction and be able to express using them. So this is a period when the child is trying to build up the understanding of the different languages and the nonverbal gestures or communication practices that come with the different codes. So afterwards, the child may actually begin showing you imitation of short sentences or phrases, or they may use canned phrases in a very repetitive way, carrier phrase or formulaic-like. And then eventually, this child would be able to after a code switching period where you see, child using the same different languages in the same sentence, eventually the child would actually, break away from the formula or the carrier phrase or the code switching behavior into using specific language patterns and nonverbal patterns at specific times. In other words, the child would know when to use what language and how. For example, the child would use strictly English and North American mainstream quote-unquote manners with the teachers, and at home with grandpa, child would use their home language and their own sets of nonverbal cues. This is when the child truly masters when to use what. That's all I have to introduce diversity in the SLP profession for all of you. Hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.